This feels like one of those things that should work, but physics just says nope. A lot of people have wondered if you could actually build a bridge to the moon. It's a classic thought experiment, and it tells us some really surprising things about the universe and, well, how our own brains can get things wrong.
Okay, so let's dig in. To answer this, we've got to be clear on what we mean by a bridge. For our purposes, we're talking about one continuous, solid structure, from the ground on Earth all the way to the surface of the moon. No tricks, no space elevators, no orbital rings, none of that. We're doing this the hard way, the really, really impossible way.
So, the first and most obvious roadblock is gravity itself, right? Your first thought is probably just build a super tall tower. Grab a strong material like steel and just keep stacking it up. But, when you actually run the numbers, you hit a wall. A very real, very physical wall.
Check this out. Even a column made of steel, one of the strongest things we can build with, can only get about 15 kilometers high on Earth. After that, the sheer weight of the top part just completely crushes the bottom. That's it. Game over. You're not even out of the stratosphere yet.
And here's the scale of what we're actually up against. We need to cover 384,400 kilometers. Our little 15-kilometer tower, it doesn't even register. It's barely a speck. So yeah, that's the bottom line. We have a bit of a structural problem. You just can't build up. The material itself would fail catastrophically long before we got anywhere near the moon.
And that brings us to what's known as the Jello problem. See, we think of steel as this super rigid, super strong material. But when you get to these kinds of planetary scales, it starts to behave more like wobbly Jello. Gravity would just squish our giant bridge into a ball. The pressure at the base would be just, well, unimaginable.
But hey, the question wasn't, can we build a safe bridge to the moon? It was just, can we build one? And it turns out, physics has a pretty clever, if completely terrifying, solution that uses a totally different principle.
The secret ingredient here is centrifugal force. As the Earth spins on its axis, it's constantly flinging everything on it outwards into space. If we could build our structure long enough, that outward push could actually fight against gravity and hold the whole thing up. And this is where it gets really weird. The structure wouldn't be a bridge in the traditional sense, getting crushed under its own weight. It would be more like a tether, constantly being flung outwards by the Earth's spin, and we'd have to anchor it to the ground just to keep it from flying away into space.
So, great, we found a way to make it stand. But in solving one problem, we've gone and created a brand new one. And this new problem is monumentally dangerous. The entire thing is under incredible tension, like a planetary-scale whip just straining to break free from one single anchor point on Earth. Which leads to the one little question you really don't want to have to ask. What happens if that one single point of failure fails? Well, if that anchor lets go, you don't have a bridge anymore. What you have is a 384,400-kilometer tether snapping free. It whips around the planet at orbital speeds, superheating the atmosphere into plasma as it slices through. It would obliterate every single satellite in its path before finally slamming back down onto the surface with unimaginable force. At that point, you're not an engineer anymore. You've just created the largest weapon in the solar system, a geyser of death that wraps itself around the entire planet. Okay, but let's just put aside the minor inconvenience of vaporizing a continent and wiping out modern civilization, because there's an even more serious problem here, a legal one. You see, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 is very, very clear on this matter. Your space object, which is now, a plasma-wreathed agent of doom, has caused some damage. And guess what? You are on the hook for it. So let's just weigh our options here. On the one hand, you've got the complete annihilation of life as we know it. On the other, you have a clear violation of an international treaty. I think we can all agree which one is the real tragedy here. So let's just put a fine point on this, shall we? This is one of those projects that probably shouldn't get past the scribbled on a napkin phase.
Really, it's a horrible idea. I'm starting to suspect that whoever first asked this question might not have Earth's best interests at heart.
So in the end, the answer is a big, resounding no. It's not going to work. And it's not because it's too complicated, it's because our gut feeling for how things should work just completely falls apart at these massive scales. Physics has rules, and it doesn't really care what feels right to us. And this isn't just about bridges to the moon, right? This exact failure of our intuition happens all the time. Once you see it, you start spotting the same mistake in all kinds of so-called science hacks and big ideas. So that kind of leaves us with one final thought to chew on.
What other huge, grand ideas, whether they're from science fiction or some new tech startup, just completely collapse when you actually sit down and run the numbers? Because at the end of the day, the numbers don't lie.